Welcome to the Organic Wine Podcast. Hello, this is Adam Huss coming to you from Los Angeles, California. Thanks so much for listening. This episode is made possible because of the sponsorship of my winery, Centralis. But your support is what makes Centralis possible, so really you make this podcast possible. If you get inspiration, information, or even just entertainment from listening to the Organic Wine Podcast, please consider supporting it directly by writing a review or Venmoing $5 to @Centralis, or by visiting centraliswine.com and purchasing a bottle or signing up for our email list. That's CENTRALAS wine.com. Thanks for your support. It was such a pleasure to geek out with Martha Stoumen about making wine for this episode. This conversation gets highly technical and even more highly helpful for anyone at any level who is making wine or thinking about it. If you want to take your winemaking to the next level, listen closely. I have learned multiple new things from Martha every time I've re-listened to our conversation. The ostensible subject of this episode is how to make natural wine. But of course there isn't one way to make natural wine. Instead, Martha offers the principles and perspectives and biology and chemistry that can help you approach winemaking holistically with the goal of helping this living being, the grapevine, achieve what seems to be its ultimate destiny. And we do a case study on one of her wines to give an intimate and detailed view of the practical application of her approach. The one impression that I hope you'll get, if nothing else, is just how thoughtful Martha is about every aspect of this process. She thinks carefully about everything from the macro to the micro and asks great questions about how to use human efforts to facilitate all of the non-human elements that work for us to create and refine and protect a beautiful wine. We could not have asked for a better teacher. Martha makes wine in Sebastopol, California, and you can buy her wines at marthastoumen.com. That's Martha, STOUMEN.com, and I highly recommend that you do try them. We talk about how well adapted Italian varieties of grapes are to making natural wine in California, and she has several examples for sale that show just how deliciously true that is. What we don't talk a lot about is Martha's backstory and biography, so please check out her other interviews on various other podcasts because she is definitely worth getting to know better. Enjoy. Martha, welcome. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
It's a real pleasure to be able to talk to you. And for many reasons, including, you may be one of the few people who know something about growing Narodavala in California, which is of near and dear to my heart. And you're one of the few people that I just found out have made an aged rosé at some point. You played around with aged rosés. Are you still making aged rosés?
Yeah, I am. I started making aged rosés kind of when I started making wine in California for my own label. So 2014 was the first time I made a rosé with the intention of aging it. And yeah, the varieties, the varietals have changed a little bit over time that I work with for those wines, but I love a good aged rosé. What can I say? The kind of more savory side. I'm a fan.
Yeah, I do too. I've actually put some new American oak and, a year of barrel age and a couple of rosés that we've done.
Yeah, I really like those characters. Kind of when whatever the skeleton of the wine is fleshed out a little bit more with some of that age. Is the American oak, is that inspired by Lopez de Heredia or?
No, it's not, but that's really interesting. No, I mean, that's more inspired by just trying to keep things local, sort of an ecological approach in general to our wines, like from barrel to bottle to everything.
Yeah.
The farming and, everything else. But
makes sense. And American oak is cool. I mean, you probably have talked about this on other episodes potentially, but you can actually use more of the tree just because of the way the grain grows in American oak. You don't have as much waste when you're making barrels as French oak.
Definitely have not talked about that. So that's awesome.
Fun little fact.
You just made me love it even more. I mean, it can be, it can be a lot. It's definitely a different impression on the wine, but the creaminess that comes from that aging too, that with rosés, because I love, like, it sort of one's a balance that you almost don't find. Like I love the minerality and crispness of a young rosé, but I sometimes find myself wishing for something that lingered a little bit longer in my mouth, and I feel like that age really gives it like a creaminess that it almost makes it a broader pairing choice for some things.
Totally, totally. Yeah, for me, I mean, I love the few examples of aged rosés that I've had, but I also um, I like my wine with food, and I also love trying to make things that potentially are new experiences for people. Kind of trying to
Yeah.
just show examples of out of the box, sort of like, here's the generalization about rosé, and yet wine can be so many different things, and here's a
Right.
counterexample to that. So that's a fun thing to
Yeah,
do.
I find a big part of what I do is just trying to do something that isn't done already 100 times, so that there's you just don't want to rebuild the wheel, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And then certain grapes. I mean, the rosé we age the longest is made from Negro Amaro, and it's from a specific site that just
Oh.
has. It's already an acidic grape naturally,
Hmm.
and then this site itself just really, really brings acidity to whatever is planted there. And so I do feel like aging is almost necessary. So kind of listening to the base ingredient there was, I
How
feel like,
long is a
necessary.
long time?
For us, let's see, we age it for after fermentation's complete, which is done in barrel, neutral oak. We age it for about 2 years, depending on the wine,
Nice.
or the
Yeah.
year, the vintage. But
Hmm.
yeah, around 2 years, and then a year of bottle age.
Oh wow. No, that's for real. So that is like getting into the Spanish realm of
Yeah, not
aging.
quite the 10 years that the Lopez Heredia is, but I have tasted. So let's see, the Negro Amaro we started making in 2015, and I drank one of those 2015s the other day, and it was beautiful. So yeah, that's
Mm.
when we release it, but I do think that it could age a lot longer, and hopefully we can
Yeah.
start building up a little bit of a library program there, but
Oh,
that's something
fantastic.
that we weren't able to do in the beginning of the business, just cash
You
flow
needed.
wise. Yeah.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah.
You mentioned Negro Amaro.
Mhm.
It sounds like you work and have sought out some Italian varieties to work with.
Yeah. Yeah, I have. And I think there's a few factors that steered me in that direction. I mean, kind of at the basis of my thinking for the varieties that I work with is starting from a place of really wanting to do as little as possible in the vineyard in terms of inputs. So,
Hmm.
um, I went through all of these apprenticeships, and I went to school at UC Davis and learned about grape growing a little bit there, and definitely in the field a little bit more. Davis is a little bit more of a kind of an enology school still at this point, but
Mm.
there is definitely a grape growing component. And they do teach you about different indices you can look at in terms of like basically just a combination of temperature and humidity, as an indicator for how much mildew you may get in the vineyard, which is, in California, that's really kind of the number one, and worldwide, I'd say, but certainly in California, that has a drier climate, the number one kind of nemesis, vineyard nemesis that you experience. So,
Powdery. Yeah.
yeah, powdery mildew. Yeah, exactly. We don't really have the downy mildew. It's popped up a few times in wet years. I remember that was like breaking news that Santa Barbara had downy mildew, but that's usually
Wow.
a European thing.
Yeah.
Um, so
Or East
powder,
Coast. Yeah.
yeah, or East Coast. So, yeah, so powdery mildew is kind of our number one, I guess, our Achilles heel in the vineyard. And
Yeah.
so, knowing that one piece of information, I started looking to what areas in California have less mildew pressure, period, just
Okay.
naturally speaking. So, trying to make it a little easier on myself. I mean, I grew up in Sebastopol in Sonoma
Uh-huh.
County, which is pretty, I would say it's a beautiful, beautiful area. But in terms of that humidity, temperature window that mildew thrives in. I mean, Sonoma County is pretty ripe for that.
Yeah. Oh,
So
yeah.
growing up in those conditions where you're like, oh, it's foggy, and then it, is this nice kind of 70, 80 degree
Right.
80 degree weather in the spring. So it's not just like temperature and humidity to think about. It's what time of the year is it occurring and what's happening with the vine itself. So
Right.
Going back to like choosing what varietals to work with, again, started from a place of wanting to have low input, wanting to do low input farming in the vineyard. So I tried to search out places in California that have low powdery mildew pressure to begin with.
And is that's hot and dry, I imagine, maybe
Exactly.
a little breezy. Yeah.
Hot, dry, breezy. And particularly, I think another thing to be a little bit even more specific, having a really like compressed spring. So going from a cold winter to a hot summer in like in a relatively short period of time, I think is really helpful. So because springtime is, kind of that perfect, it's humid as in California, at least, as the winter rains, hopefully in years that we have it, are kind of like the ground and the environment's drying out and it's warming up at the same time. So you get this kind of warm, humid environment in California in the spring. But, mildew over, 90-ish degrees. This is something I may have to look up to pinpoint the exact temperature, but starts to not be able to thrive and grow. So once you kind of hit that 90-degree mark, and again, depending on your humidity, you don't have the mildew pressure you normally would. And plants are particularly susceptible. I mean, vines are perennial woody plants, so they have their carbohydrate stores in their wood, and then in the spring they push really rapid growth from their buds, and all of that rapid kind of tender light green, those light green shoots are much more susceptible to mildew because they're in their growth phase. Yeah.
I mean, from what I know, the spores actually overwinter in the bark and trunk, on the trunk and spurs of the vines as well. So it's sort of like it provides a habitat for the mildew as well as the perfect food for the mildew in the spring.
Exactly. And not to say that those cold winters will necessarily eliminate powdery mildew, but it will help.
Right.
Nothing will be active during the winter. So if you have kind of a more mild winter, then you might actually have powdery mildew growth kind of in that woody tissue. So yeah, having kind of this compressed spring period, cold winter to pretty hot summer relatively quickly. And then, like you said, the ventilation, kind of wind airflow is really, those are all the things that I was looking for to be naturally occurring. And I feel like the greater Ukiah area of slightly more inland Mendocino really ticked a lot of those boxes.
Got it.
So that was kind of the first thing, is like, where in California do I want to work with, because it's going to be easier to farm with minimal inputs. And I, definitely farmed in a few other locations or purchased fruit from a few other locations. And there are other places too, like Contra Costa County has very little mildew pressure, generally speaking. And there's a few other areas, certain areas in the foothills for sure.
I think the LA basin may be like 10 months out of the year the perfect conditions for powdery mildew. So it's just like you can't, I mean, it's just an unending battle. Like right now it's 73 degrees and overcast outside right now in January. So so it's growing, it's doing it. It never goes dormant. And then up in the high desert, it's, we have extremely low humidity and breezy hot temperatures the problem there is water availability.
Yeah.
So it's like the place where it might be ideal conditions in some degrees doesn't necessarily make it conducive for growing the vines in a ecological way. Do you find that as well? I mean, it looks like, I mean, Ukiah, I think you could get away with it. And there's probably like dry farm vineyards that are pre-prohibition vineyards up there, I imagine.
Yeah, yeah. So we do actually work with mostly dry farmed vineyards, and there are so many other factors. So there's always the positive and negative to choosing a place. Ukiah, we generally get enough winter rainfall that once the vines are established, we can dry farm them, and we do. So there's not a ton of pre-prohibition anymore, but there's a lot of post-World War II plantings. So vines that were planted in the, late 1940s, which is pretty cool. And those have managed to do pretty well in drought years like last year, compared to the other vineyards that are not dry farmed, but water was so scarce in Mendocino County that all ag water was cut off. So those were, those vineyards went through a pretty deep shock. But I think, so understanding, okay, what are the trade-offs in the area that you're in? And being in Mendocino County, it's like, well, yeah, water's a problem, and also it's hot. So, I mean, elegance in the wines that you make is really kind of a tricky, tricky needle to thread. And so you almost have to work with Italian varietals or things that really maintain acidity. So that was kind of the whole thought process there.
And when you said the word elegance, I guess my question for you is, do you equate the retention of acidity with elegance? Is that interchangeable? Is there more to the word elegance than just acidity retention?
I think acidity is kind of the driving force. So I mean, to decode that phrase, probably yes, acidity is kind of one of the number one things I'm looking at, but that kind of can be an indication of overall balance. So not just acidity, but what are the flavors? How ripe is the grape, and what's the sugar content, and acidity and tannin and all of that? How are those all coinciding during the ripening and harvest season?
Yeah. And I mean, this is something I've been saying for a long time too, which is just, I feel like given California's climate, we're definitely for elegance. I mean, if we want big fruity, extraction, maybe French grapes are great, but Italian varieties seem to be like, we're even hotter than Italy in a lot of ways. And we're bringing out in a lot of ways some of the fruitier characteristics of these, what would come across as rustic when you're in Italy. You come here and you get a lot more. I mean, you retain the acid, but then you get a nice balanced fruit profile as well. I don't know. Is that something that you've found? I should be asking that as a question.
Yeah. No. I totally agree with you there. I think, generalizing California, but we have fruit characteristics like in gobs. We have so much fruit in our grapes. So many fruity characteristics that kind of understanding.
We're just fruity here.
We're just super fruity, super bubbly. But if we're going to import grapes from other places, which we mostly do, besides a few folks working with hybrids, or native grapes. I think looking at like, how do these grapes perform in their environment, and then if they are perhaps, like you said, rustic, more savory in their home turf, bringing them to California, you can hopefully retain some of those notes, but you're going to get a lot of fruit on top of it, I've found.
Now, and it tends to be a vigorous grower with big clusters, as I understand, sort of, which helps with that, the botrytis and the mildew in the clusters, because the clusters are kind of big and loose, right?
Exactly. And that was another thing that drew me to the grape, besides the flavor. I mean, and the acidity, the ability to maintain really nice acidity in hot climates. It was that loose cluster. So trying to not spray as much. And I don't
Right.
think it's particularly susceptible to mildew. I don't think it's like, oh my gosh, this grape never gets mildew. But it's not like there's certain grapes that are notorious, like Carignan. If it's planted in an area that gets mildew, it will get mildew. It is one of those like kind of it's weak when it comes to mildew resistance. But
Got it.
I found that Neradavla seems to have like I feel like medium to high. Again, it's hard because
that's great.
All the areas that I work with it are pretty low pressure.
Okay.
But so like having, kind of a thicker skin and a looser cluster and all those things also attracted me to the grape.
Yeah, no, I've heard that as well. I'm curious. So let's, as a way to sort of transition to how to make natural wine, so to speak.
Yeah.
What numbers are you getting at harvest? Because you're talking about acid. So can we put that in an actual, let's talk pH and at certain bricks, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, perfect. Briccarelli Ranch Neradavla, which is probably our most acidic site, has a 3.4 pH. This is after fermentation, so it might have been lower than that.
After mallow too.
Yeah, after mallow. So low, and that is a 12.3% alcohol.
Okay, so that's a pretty reasonable, like around 20 bricks, something like that, 21.
That 12.3, that's usually around 23 bricks actually. So
oh, really?
The conversion isn't super, and it's a dry wine. The conversion for some reason isn't super high in that vineyard.
Huh,
so
okay.
Yeah. And then let's see, other things. Acidity, titratable acidity is 6.8 grams per liter. It's pretty high there too.
Oh, okay. Yeah. That's in the zone. Nice.
Mm-hmm.
Would that have gone into what I tasted recently?
Yeah, that would have been primarily what you tasted. And that's the Briccarelli, the Neradavla risotto that we make is 100% Briccarelli, because that is, again, probably the most acidic site. And I just think it makes the best risotto.
Yeah. I mean, well, I thought both of those were extremely balanced. The numbers, that surprises me. The impression wasn't that acidic.
Yeah. It needs to age a little bit, but once it gets over that aging hump and then goes through malolactic, I find that, I remember the first year I picked it in 2015. First year we started working with Briccarelli, I thought, it's why I made a risotto actually, because I tasted the grape and I was like, man, with tannin and this sort of screaming acidity, because it tastes acidic when it comes into the winery. It's like, I'm going to have to age this for at least 5 years before release. And it was more like 2. And then...
Oh, wow. As a rosé?
Sorry, as a red.
As a red, okay.
Yeah, 2 years in barrel and then like another year in bottle. So not aged, but not the 5 years I thought it was going to need in barrel in order to open up. So I was a little bit surprised by the red about how kind of it relaxed a little more quickly than I thought it would. But yeah, I made the risotto because I was like, I can't have all of this age for 5 years and have no wine to sell. So let's split it in half and make risotto out of some of it.
And so is that the 2019? Or which one are you looking at?
Oh, the numbers that I just gave you? Or
yeah,
that's the 2021. So you haven't had it yet. I would have to look up the 2019 numbers.
But okay.
Just similar. Yeah.
Nice. That's amazing. Yeah, and the 19 you aged that long as well?
Yeah, the 19 was aged about that. It might have gone into bottle at 18 months, 24.
Yeah. Well, it looks like you have very good, one thing I wanted to compliment you on is the very good technical transparency, and everything that you do with a wine is listed on that wine sheet, on that wine page on your website. So some of it looks like it's there.
Yeah. and that would be that would be definitely the source of truth rather than my brain, because it's funny. You think you're going to all the wines are so important and you're so involved with them when you're making them. And then as the years blend together,
Well,
you
it's
forget what
because
happened
you
this
also
year.
drink them, so that
Yeah.
helps erase that memory.
Totally, totally. Yeah, yeah. And I saw you put your ingredient labeling on your wine, which I think is very cool. And it's something I think we would love to do at some point. It's more of just getting, the time it takes to print the labels, and then
Yeah.
finishing the blends as those labels are in the printer. And so it has become a little bit more difficult for
Yes.
us to
Yeah.
do that.
It is hard. Yeah. Exactly. Like if you're trying to, right. I mean, you can't really add anything. Like once you've printed the label, you're sort of like, well, it is what it is at this point. If you need a little something else, then you're in trouble. And
Yeah,
you don't want to reprint just because
exactly.
something came up at the last minute on bottling
Yeah,
day or whatever.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
And
that is true.
most of our
Uh,
wines are blends. So, even if it's 100% Neradabla and, 75% is from Briccarelli Ranch, we have a few other vineyards we work with that may end up making it in the blend for that last 25%. And so for us, it's just easier to stick with the technical sheets, but
yeah.
definitely encourage people to look at them because winemaking's cool. And we're always trying to kind of do less to showcase the fruit and the site even more. But yeah, I'm proud of where we are right now with that.
That's yeah, no, I think it's really admirable, and I wish more people were transparent that way. And look, I mean, we list ingredients now, and that's a big thing that we tout. But you're right, like all it's going to take is one, like, oh, we've got to reprint, 5,000 labels, and we'll be like, we're not doing that again. Like,
Yeah.
no,
Or
thank you.
yeah, or when we were small, I mean, we very rarely do this, but we filtered one or two lots in the time that Martha
Oh,
Stoumen
right.
wines has existed. And so,
If you put if
it's
you put
really fun to
untimed,
say like, oh, we
unfiltered,
don't do anything. But then when you do tell people what if that's what you're sticking to is transparency, I think it's been really great for us because we work also with distributors and sales reps, and everybody's on board with the natural wine philosophy. So when something
right?
deviates from that, a particular wine, it sparks a lot of conversation, and I think it's been really great for us.
Well, that's a really good. I mean, I wanted to ask you about that. Actually, when you say that, when you
Yeah.
say something deviates, and you've had to have conversations about that, how has that gone? What are some examples of that? I'm really curious.
Yeah, I think filtration was the main one. So, we
Okay.
try to work with, I kind of can't emphasize enough how important the grape and the site and the farming practices are. So you have, grapes that come into the vineyard that are suitable for making natural wine. So you have to, I
Right.
think having a certain pH, there are always outliers. We have wine that's a white wine that's close to pH 4 that we're bottling that's been aging, and it tastes delicious and it isn't funky and it's not microbial and it seems stable. So of course there are exceptions to the rules, but in general, like having a lower pH, higher acidity, using some tannin extraction to your advantage in order to help naturally protect the wine without preservatives. Like all of those things are important natural winemaking tenets. But occasionally we have a vineyard. I don't know, I've noticed this even a little bit more since crazy weather patterns have happened. But, vineyard that's a little stressed out during the growing season, and maybe the pH is higher than it normally has been. And the options, and it doesn't seem like it's going to be as stable in the bottle, or we want to blend it with other lots that do seem stable. But this wine, we don't want to increase, if it does seem like it has, a lot of lactic acid bacteria during the fermentation, for instance, introducing it to those other lots might just kind of spread this microbial instability. So, the options would be, if you're using sulfur, to try to increase your microbial stability by killing the microbes in your
Mhm.
wine, then at a higher pH, you have to add a lot of sulfur to do that.
Right.
So for us, it's like, well, we're a business that's not necessarily going to, and the wine tastes good right now, but to see where it's going, we're not going to risk having, a bunch of mousy wine on the market. It's just not
Right.
not what I want to do. And, everyone has their own path when they're confronted with these decisions. But for us, filtering the wine, especially like cross flow filtering, which is through it's kind of a different type of filtration. The wine flows parallel to the membrane, and the membrane's made out of ceramic, versus other sorts of filtration that's flowing perpendicular to the filtration membrane and really pushes the wine through and is a little bit more, I'd say, less gentle on the wine than cross flow filtration.
Right.
We have decided in those circumstances, when we have a higher pH, because we're not going to add acidity to our wine, that filtering them is the best thing for us to do. And so, while I guess it could remove terroir a bit, which I think is the concern with why that's kind of written into the unwritten natural winemaking rules, I still just think it's the best thing for that wine, for that lot, and that point in time. So yeah, it's kind of a trade-off between high sulfur use or adding acidity to the fermentation, which I would also get into the fact that I don't think that that's that terrible, even though we don't do it. It's one of those things that it's like, yeah, I don't mind removing the microbes like mechanically through filtration if that's what needs to happen. So the wine may feel a little less alive, but it'll also be a little more stable. And usually in those circumstances, we try to blend it with wines that haven't been filtered, so you still have microbial population. It's just not it's not a bunch of lactic acid bacteria, for instance. So.
Right. Well, so and you can do what would be considered a sterile filtration with a crossflow.
It is not completely sterile, but so getting it a little bit more technical about filtration, there's something called absolute. The porosity, so
0.4 micron or whatever.
So 0.45, exactly. 0.45 micron is considered a small enough porosity to remove both yeast, which are much larger than bacteria, and bacteria. And so 0.45 micron is considered sterile filtration, but only if it's an absolute filter. So filters are, the way they're classified, there's two different types. One's called nominal and one's called absolute. So absolute means that the largest pore size in that filter would be 0.45. So I think of it as like you're absolutely getting that porosity throughout the entire filter, no matter what. Nominal is more of an average. So like you might have, just because the nature of filters, a lot of them are made of cellulose or ceramic or things that are not 100% homogeneous in terms of how big their porosity is. So you would be getting an average porosity of 0.45 micron. I actually think crossflow is a little bit smaller than 0.4. You can get a little bit smaller than 0.45, but it's a nominal filter. It's an average. So you might have some bacteria sneaking through. But that's okay. The idea isn't to, necessarily totally sterilize the wine. Again, we try to blend things. If for some reason a vineyard is out of balance or stressed out during the growing season, and the grape chemistry and therefore the wine chemistry is off in the cellar, then we try to definitely blend for, I guess, better numbers. Secondary to blending for taste. I mean, taste is obviously what we blend for the most. But those two things usually tend to coincide where you're like, oh, this tastes good because it's also in balance.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. No, yeah. So just to go back, so to make a natural wine successfully, as you said, you're starting, I'm sure you'd say, with the farming of the vineyard, and then it's the right vine grown in the right place, picked at the right time to give you grapes that are whole and healthy um, and in balance in a way that allows you to do very little basically and still have the wine turn out. Um,
Totally. Yeah.
so it's really, I mean, that's what's, I think, one of the beautiful things about natural wine is it really forces you to focus on the farming first, because you can't just take any grape and hope to have success. You might get lucky, but without that real attention and understanding to what's going on in the vineyard and how the grapes are responding, and to everything, that sort of intuition that comes from seeing multiple vintages, you're rolling the dice, it seems like. And then hopefully you've learned at a certain point by observing and farming well to know when the grapes and respond to the grapes, and to take the grapes off at the right time. And then, okay, so now we're in the vineyard. I mean, maybe it's easy to talk about a specific wine for you. Is that, do you have one that you'd like to just sort of go through the process of what's involved and how you manage
Yeah.
something from the vineyard to the bottle?
Yeah, I'll talk about making the Venturi Vineyard Carignan, because I think that's, it's a wine I've been making since 2014. It's always the same plot, same grapes, and all of them, get fermented together. It's a little probably less complicated than some of our co-ferments or our blends. So that vineyard was planted in the late 1940s. So the vines are a little over 70 years old. And I mention that only because I feel like the chemistry coming off of that vineyard, the grapes are really well balanced. So, and Carignan itself, unlike Zinfandel, for instance, Carignan has a little bit of a wider picking window, which means that it ripens a little more slowly. So I feel like I have time to check on it a little bit more, to really pick at a point in time when I feel like there's a lot of fruit character, but the tannins aren't green. They've kind of matured, and that the acidity is like in a really nice place, and the sugar is not super high. So that's nice for me, picking this plot in particular. The old vine adds to that, and then the fact that it's Carignan really is helpful with choosing a picking date. And so Larry's crew comes in and hand harvests everything. Everything we work with is hand harvested. But particularly with these like dry farmed head trained vines, you have to hand harvest. There's no other options, because they're like little trees. And
right.
So, and I think the fact that they are kind of in that they look like little trees, means that the fruit is really spread out and it's well ventilated, even though Carignan's kind of this typically known to have mildew. It's in this dry climate, and they're almost like ornaments on a Christmas tree, where there's a lot of space. They're like equally spaced out, and there's airflow, and they're not hanging against like with a vertical trellis where the fruit's hanging against the shoots or the leaves. You just don't have that airflow. So, and I'll be on the trailer while they're harvesting, and as the crew comes and dumps their little buckets, I'll pick out leaves in particular. And if there's any rot, I mean, I haven't seen rot in California for so many years. It's just so dry here now. But if there's any rot or any mildew or raisins, I'll pull those out.
So you're just doing that in the picking buckets. You're just out in the field doing like a field sort. You don't have a sorting table. Or do you bring it in and then do a second sort?
We do have a sorting table at the winery, but we don't use it very often because we don't need to, but we would. And that's, I guess, like, we talked about filtration, which is kind of like the last end resort, but you're doing all these things first to prevent having to get there, which is, growing things well and making sure. So basically we're just looking at, does the grape taste good? Is it in balance? All the components that you want. And then also, is the skin intact and is it healthy? Or is it, because the skin is really important, that there's like a waxy bloom on the grape. that contains all of the yeast and bacteria that are
necessary.
necessary. I mean, what ferments your wine is yeast from the vineyard at first, and then yeast in your cellar. So we'll get to that point, but having that intact, healthy, waxy bloom, that's going to kick off your fermentation.
Can I ask you,
Yeah.
what numbers for the Carignan are you looking for? What's the range that you're like, okay, it's about time to pick, or it is time to pick?
Yeah, I mean about 20,
are you
22.5 bricks is great. So somewhere in there. But I do a lot of tasting. I don't worry as much about whether a lot of a lot of winemakers or growers will look and try to crunch the seeds and see if the seeds are dry
brown,
and brittle. I don't worry about that. I don't think that that's as much of an indicator, at least for me. Or I don't look at whether the stems are woody, because that's more of a varietal thing, I feel like. But I do taste it, and I really like, as I'm tasting the grapes, really like kind of almost grind the skins in my teeth and really try to taste them. And if I get any of that, like if you've all tasted like unripe banana skin, or like try to bite into a banana to peel it and it's not quite ripe, that intense green tannin, that's then we're not going to pick yet. So but
are you looking at pH at that point? I mean, or do you okay, so you look at both pH and bricks.
When we first started, I didn't have a pH meter because, again, really scrappy to begin with, but it's something we invested in. It's a couple $100, a handheld one that we can bring into the field. And so we'll test pH and we'll test bricks. So measure of more or less measure sugar. Those are the two things we do. We don't test anything else before we pick, but we just taste a lot. So
got it. Okay.
Yeah. No, good. So we're sorting out anything in the field that we don't want, and then drive the grapes back to the winery. And
is there a time? I mean, is this midday at this point?
This is usually early morning, and
early morning.
Yeah. So,
are you doing night picking?
We are not doing night picking. So the coldest time of the day is actually right before sunrise. So night picks, actually your fruit can be a little bit warmer, but mostly it's just really hard with these older head trained vineyards to do night picks. Because fruit's missed. There's not like one fruit zone on the vine. Again, it's kind of like a Christmas tree where you're like looking all up and down. So it's good to have light for that. And so, we pick first thing, we get there right before sunrise. So I'm usually leaving my house around 4:30, driving up the hour to get to the vineyard, and then start the pick, and then driving things back. And the fruit's really pretty cold at this point. So I've had picks that have been delayed for, one logistical reason or another, and the fruit has come in much warmer. And I know it's not, industry standard, but I've actually really liked those fermentations. They kick off right away. And so for native fermentations, I actually like things to be a little bit warmer, but the crew is ready and they want to pick when it's cool out. And I totally get that. So that's what we do. And then we come back and I make this wine 100% whole cluster. So we don't put it through a distemmer at all. What we generally do is we foot tread a few of the bins. So maybe, 10%, I guess, of the total.
Okay.
And dump that into the bottom of the fermenter. So it's skins and stems and juice, just to kind of get the fermentation a little bit started, prime it a little bit. And then we put a bunch of all the rest whole cluster on the top.
Okay.
And I don't do carbonic maceration for this. So we don't seal the tank. I usually do put a little bit of either carbon dioxide gas just in the tank, which is heavier than air, so it'll stay in the tank, or a little dry ice just to keep it a little bit fresh, and not encourage vinegar production. And then we'll take, usually at this point, there's something that's already fermenting in the winery. So whatever is active, whether it's red, white, rosé from another lot, I'll take a couple buckets from that. That's kind of at this like peak fermentation, and dump those buckets into the fermenter.
And to that point that you just made, I think that the warmth is another maybe good reason, if you're doing a natural style, which will help prevent the VA, the vinegar production, right, as well, because once you get the primary kicked off quickly, it will sort of take over some of that other stuff. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. So it's
either protected with a blanket. I mean, it's also protected with the natural blanket of CO2 at that point, because you've started primary and the yeast are producing the CO2.
Yeah, exactly. So it's just in that like first day or two where things, you want to encourage, you want to discourage vinegar production. So, that would be more kind of discouraging some of the bacterial action that could happen, and encouraging the yeast. So, and then we'll foot tread it at the top of the fermenter, every night and every morning until the fermentation kicks off. And so you still have a lot of whole cluster throughout the fermentation. And we kind of like to foot tread it and slowly break up the grapes in order to more slowly release the sugars. So for this particular wine, we want the fermentation kind of slow and low, like more of a simmer, than anything too eruptive. And we do more fermentations that are, I guess, warmer and quicker and more active for different grapes. But for this one, I just really like kind of a lighter hand. It makes a lighter bodied wine and more aromatic because the fermentation is cooler. The yeast don't build as much heat because the yeast population, instead of it kind of having a really sharp peak and then, come down the other side of fermentation slowly, this fermentation takes usually about 3 to 3.5 weeks. Whereas our other native fermentations, exactly.
Rather than exponential.
Totally.
Well, how big is the fermenter that you use for this then? It sounds like a pretty big one.
Yeah, this one's this plot usually comes in around 4 tons. So that's usually the size of the fermenter. An open top fermenter, a little bit bigger than that. It's not huge, but not small.
Right.
I tend to like to ferment things unless you have temperature control on your tank, some sort of like glycol. I think 4 tons is kind of a great maximum. I love 1 to 4 ton fermentations. I feel like are great in terms of like their heat, their ability to like not overheat, but have enough heat just from the fermentation themselves. So
and you're getting into the 4-ton fermenter and doing additional stomping.
We'll get into.
Do you have to wear a gas mask or anything?
No, usually. So we try to match it so that the grapes are, your head is well above the top of the fermenter. So it's to the point where like at most you would be waist. Like your waist height would be where the top of the fermenter is.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. And then once it gets to, there's still a lot of CO2. Once it gets so...
I say this more as like a public service announcement for anybody listening out there. Like, don't get into a big fermenter of fermenting grapes and stop them.
So important. Never do that. Yes. Never get into a fermenter where you're... where your head is not well above the top of it. And also be careful. So I sit on the edge of the fermenter and I kind of test how, thick the grapes are, because once fermentation becomes active, all of the grapes will float to the top and you'll have liquid below. And if you break through that cap with your body weight, you'll fall to the bottom of the fermenter. So don't do that either. Very, very bad. It's actually, definitely one of the most dangerous parts of winemaking is understanding carbon dioxide and how much is produced and how quickly, and that it sinks. So it's, it'll sink to the bottom of anything. So when you're digging, once the fermentation's done, partway through fermentation, we'll do what's called a délestage, where we move all of the liquid from the fermentation, we'll drain it off put it into another tank, and then pump it all back over the top. So it's kind of a way to like break up some of the juice channels that happen in the wine and fill out a little bit of the mid palate. So yeah. I mean, fermentations are we will do some pump overs too. So there's like, obviously I don't have like an exact recipe for this wine. It's a lot more feeling. I mean, this is generally how we do it, but feeling out how things are. And
well, maybe that's a good question then. What guides some of those decisions? Is it I'm trying something new this year, or is it the wine is tasting and smelling this way, so I think it needs a little zhuzh in this direction?
Totally the zhuzh. Yeah, a little bit of like, Tim and I will taste and smell every fermentation every day. And you can get a lot of information just from smelling it. But also from those early foot treadings and kind of those early body punch downs that you're doing safely, you'll get a lot of information about like just temperature and activity, because your feet will go in and out of cold pockets and warm pockets. And so you're like, okay, this is it's not a like super active homogeneous fermentation yet. It's still kind of kicking off in certain areas, and tasting the grapes on top and tasting the whole clusters that are a little bit underneath the top of the surface. We'll pull one of those out with like a plastic rake or something, food grade rake, and we'll taste those clusters and see if there's any carbonic activity down below. So all of these things just kind of go into your brain. And then with, I guess, experience, you just kind of learn how to respond to them and think, okay, you know what, let's do a long pump over on this today. The yeast, it's earlier on in the fermentation. It seems like the yeast could use a little more oxygen to strengthen their cell wall and make more yeast. And as the fermentation gets warmer and more alcoholic, having a strong yeast species with that strong cell wall is important. So we'll pump it over for longer, and we'll get more air in it in the beginning. And there's some kind of general rules to fermenting, but then again, you'll be like, oh, this is starting to smell a little bit more like ethyl acetate. We want to go low and slow, but maybe it's a little too cold. And let's warm up the fermenter. We have these basically they look like big Bunsen burners that we'll put under the tank and move around. It's very, very high tech. And
you're out there with a blowtorch and
totally, yeah, exactly.
mask.
Just warming up the bottom of the tank, and then we'll pump it over, and that usually, even raising the temperature of the fermentation a degree or something, you don't want to overshoot it, because the yeast will, again, heat, the activity of the yeast will warm the fermentation itself. But so those sort of things, and then we'll maybe pump it over and be like, okay, this seems to be a little bit warmer, and that ethyl acetate, it won't favor, the yeast or bacteria that are making that ethyl acetate, and more Saccharomyces will take over. So understanding that microbial ecosystem is important too.
And I'm going to just put this out there as a little aside. I think you said between 1 and 4 tons is a good size for not being too big, but I think it's also a good size for not being too small. Totally. Because those bacteria that cause ethyl acetate are oxygen feeding, or they need oxygen, and if I'm tell me if I'm wrong, but I this is from years of being a home winemaker. It is very difficult to make natural wine at home, because you're working in smaller quantities, so you therefore have the wine exposed to that much more oxygen per square inch, just with a smaller quantity, using smaller vessels, more exposure to oxygen. And there's so many ways it can go wrong, or a fermentation doesn't kick off quickly enough, and then you also have a smaller quantity, so anything that gets into it can take over that whole quantity much more quickly than it could take over in a larger volume. I don't know. I please add your own to that as well.
Yeah.
Just throwing that out there.
Yeah. I mean, I think oxygen exposure can definitely be a factor in smaller fermentations. But for me, the main thing that is problematic with small fermentations is not having enough heat. So the fermentation itself, because it's I guess, got more surface area, and it doesn't have the thermal mass that a larger fermentation would. So it just doesn't have the mass itself to, so what happens is it'll cool down a lot more quickly. It's something that, you will get heat generated from the activity of yeast converting sugar to alcohol. And that will, in fact, really encourage more yeast, because they do yeast thrive best at they propagate the fastest at around 100 degrees Fahrenheit, but you don't want your fermentation to be that hot because it would overheat and cook. But the problem is with these smaller fermentations is it's just really hard to get the heat needed to have healthy yeast production and to not have some of these other non-Saccharomyces yeast and bacteria kind of take over. So, yeah, I mean, I've heard, I think when I was making wine in my backyard at Davis, I'd use like a fish tank heater sometime, where you can submerge it in the liquid.
Interesting.
And to kind of keep it a little bit warmer, or like electric blankets around your vessel or whatever, or put it in a warm spot. I mean, we again are pretty low tech at the winery. We don't.
Move it outside most times in the fall in California.
Yep, exactly. Put it out in the sun every day. So that's what we do with a lot of our fermentations. 4 tons is we can't move those tanks, but in the 1 ton fermenters that are in, the kind of like a bigger picking bin type thing, those, we definitely keep out in the sun, which is nice.
Okay. Yeah. So at this point, and you haven't added any sulfur when you've brought the grapes in and put them in the fermenter?
No. Yeah. So that's what all the sorting was about, and making sure the skins are healthy. Because I really like early on in fermentation, non-Saccharomyces cerevisiae species will be the ones that are present. And those are mostly kind of coming in from the vineyard. And what were you saying? No, I was just going to say those provide some of those kind of like more wild, what I think of as interesting flavors. And there's so many different species that they're all kind of contributing their voice, I think. And then after, a couple % of alcohol is produced, all of those yeast and bacteria usually die off, or the majority of them do. And Saccharomyces cerevisiae take over. And that's more usually present in the cellar. It's just kind of in the air, especially midway through harvest, where there's tons just everywhere. So
you'll notice like the first batch you bring in takes a week to start, and the 10th batch you bring in is fermenting the next day, basically. Totally. Bringing it in.
Yeah.
Well, and that goes to what you mentioned that before, that it's like this idea of reflecting vineyard terroir through yeast is maybe an illusion, because the ambient yeast, wherever they're fermenting, is at some point going to be dominant, or a dominant voice in the wine fermentation aspect.
Yeah, they will dominate. They'll dominate that sugar conversion, but I do think those really early, that couple of degrees alcohol in the beginning that's produced, and all the flavor compounds that are being produced at that time have a pretty big impact, even though they're not predominant throughout the fermentation. I do see them as a very important part of fermentation. And we will, we do notice that, feel like certain vineyards produce certain kind of fermentation kinetics. So I do think those, which is probably a combination of both the vineyard, microbes, the vineyard terroir, I guess, microbial terroir, and what the soil is giving in terms of nutrients to the grape that the yeast are then
I know a winemaker who actually monitors the fermentation and lets native yeast flora happen until basically like a 2% alcohol, whatever, drop in bricks or whatever it is, increase in alcohol, and then inoculates, because they're like, well, at that point, I'm just gonna I've already gotten all that I'm gonna get from the native population.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's just one philosophy, but
totally. One of my first jobs in California, we did that, where it was native fermentation until I think like when it was 5 bricks or something, they would inoculate with a stronger yeast that could ferment to a higher alcohol, because that was their style, it was like a little bit richer, and they just were
Got it.
kind of wanted it as an insurance policy to not have a stuck
Yeah.
fermentation. But our alcohols on our wines are moderate enough. We don't really we've had, an occasional stuck fermentation in one barrel every couple of years. So that's one of those fears that I'm like, I feel like it's just a fear. It's just the boogeyman.
Yeah.
It's not. Native fermentations can be totally effective.
I'm actually really excited for our first stuck fermentation because I now have a lot of, people that are asking for sweet wine. So I'm just like, well, if it happens, no problem. I might have to filter, but that's all good.
Totally.
There'll be a happy audience for that.
Yeah. That was one of the cases where we did filter a portion of our Chenin Blanc that was like off dry. And that was when it finished. And I was like, great, tastes delicious.
Yep.
I'll filter it. I've also not filtered. I mean, the first Neradavla Rosado I made, I know it had like 3 grams of sugar left when it was done fermenting, and we put it in bottle. And knowing that if it did ferment dry in bottle, it would be slightly spritzy, which I think would have been delicious with that wine.
Yeah.
But
I would be more concerned about like other bugs rather than Saccharomyces finishing eating that sugar.
Yeah. And that kind of you are playing a little Russian roulette there. So
yeah,
we did it, and I loved the way it turned out. But yeah, definitely.
I mean, that's
on large cuvées. I don't think I would have been this bold.
That's how I turned a batch of off dry wine into vinegar, basically.
Yeah.
So you are we're at the point where fermentation is happening. You've sort of felt your way through it, seeing what the fermentation needs, giving what it needs, and now you're dry.
Yeah.
I assume you wait till you're dry before pressing?
Depends on the wine. With this wine, we do. Because it's kind of this low and slow, it doesn't usually have this tannin extraction happening too quickly. So, and what we actually do with this wine, which is a bit unique, is we let it go dry. And then we actually, we put it in a certain open top fermenter that has one of those floating lids that you can adjust the height and seal the tank at any height.
Right.
And then, once it goes dry, we'll seal the tank up and leave it for the remainder of whatever a month would be, start to finish. So if the fermentation takes 3 weeks, it will be sealed up for about a week.
Just on stems and skins and everything.
On stems and skins and everything. And that's something that, they do in northern Italy with Nebbiolo. And I think with certain things that can have Carignan has beautiful tannins, but it can have kind of rustic or harsher tannins. And there's actually studies show that throughout fermentation, you'll get tannin extraction. And then if you go ahead and leave your wine on stems and skins, or just skins, it doesn't have to be stems. We have stems in there, but just skins, that what will happen is some of the tannin will rebind the skins. So it actually helps soften tannin. So if you've kind of if you've ever overshot the amount of tannin that you've extracted in a fermentation, if you actually just leave it for a little bit longer, it will start the tannin will build, and then you'll get over the top of that peak, and then it'll start to reabsorb. It will never go back to nothing. There's still have tannin there, but it will soften, and it actually helps stabilize color too. So,
that's cool.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like you could go either way, because it said you started by saying it depends on the wine, and you might press while there's still a little sugar, a little fermentation happening, which I know is another tannin management technique, right?
Yeah.
So you're getting it off skins earlier before you get the harsh extraction.
Yeah. And that's what we do with actually the majority of our wines in the cellar, is we taste for tannin and flavor.
Gotcha.
And then we press on that regardless of where the sugar is. So things might still be sweet. But the tannin feels like it's in a good place, and that's the way we try not to extract.
Now, is there, are there other things that you do for tannin management, whether it's in the vineyard or in the winery?
Yeah, I mean, I think, depending how much you're opening up your canopy and how much like UV light is getting on your grape can affect your tannin, how it tastes. So
the quality of it, not necessarily the quantity, but maybe the
exactly.
quantity too, but the
Yeah,
quality.
more the quality. And I haven't been able to like put a finger on what that actually means yet, but I did work. I worked with at Davis. My research partner was from Argentina and we were doing kind of a terroir comparison of all these different Malbec wines, and the really high altitude wines that had more UV light just had but certainly different color, but a different kind of tannin characteristic. And the only thing it felt concentrated more, but not necessarily more dry, like more, I don't know how to explain it, to be honest.
Okay, so I heard. Tell me what you think about this. The candy coating shell of a M&M and the way that it melts on your tongue. Does that help in any way? Can you just? I've heard this. I've tried to use this. It seems like it's applicable. I mean, I've tasted it where the tannins sort of are that. There's like the first experience of it when you put it in your mouth is sort of smooth, but then it quickly becomes rough. But then it melts completely away by the end, and I don't know if there's anywhere along that profile if that
yeah, rather than
becoming
dry. I mean, my parents just dropped off a huge container of M&Ms, but I haven't dug into it, and I haven't had M&Ms for a while, so I feel like
damn it.
I know, but I do feel like there is something to do with what's the final impression of that tannin in your mouth, and is it really dry, or has it kind of gone through this journey where it does add some sort of dryness, but then almost ends like in more of like a melted creaminess or something. Right. I mean, and there's all sorts of weird things where like tannin sometimes is like you'll drink a wine and you're like, whoa, all the tannin is in the front of my mouth. Like it's like right up near my front teeth. And sometimes you're like, oh, the tannin's drying out the back of my mouth. And this is true for everyone tasting this wine, at least the few people that I've been tasting with. And it's like, what is up with that? I mean, tannins are complicated. I don't know. But there does seem to be a different quality when you have more light on your grapes.
Got it. Okay, well, another question I have for you. I mean, I should let you finish if there's any other tannin management techniques.
No, I mean, the only other thing people can do, and some traditional houses do, is fine. So like, egg white fining or things like that will definitely change your tannin profile and soften things.
And I assume you do not fine.
No, we don't.
I don't either. And I mean, it seems like there's so many other options. Like maybe if you have to find, don't work with that kind of grape that you feel like you need to find. Or something.
I mean, aging things longer. Again, all of these things, like trying to mitigate it all during fermentation and like, in vineyard practices is really the way we do it. If for some reason we miss the mark, we'll probably end up blending that wine a little bit or aging it longer. So kind of our tools.
I was joking. I mean, I know there's a lot of other reasons to find for clarity and just stability if you're in a grocery store for, if that's your market, maybe it's a whole different game. So my other question, did you want to talk at all about biogenic amines? I asked you that question about adding sulfur at crush, and you had sent me some articles about those. So I didn't know if you wanted to say anything about that.
I mean,
it does seem like a new hot topic.
Exactly.
And an interesting study that really does shed some, I think, important light on our understanding, both from a health standpoint, but also just, I don't know, maybe just sort of not being on such a high horse, maybe is the way to put it, about natural wine.
Totally. Yeah, I think, I was originally drawn to natural wine because I loved the way they tasted, the vibrancy, but I also thought that I was like, oh, this is a great way to really showcase a sense of place. And I feel like they're, when done well, they're very evocative of place. And I love that. And that was what drew me to this method. I also like consumers, once you've kind of been in the business for a while, and I guess you see how the sausage is made, you want people to know that there's different quality standards out there, all across the board, and it's not on the label, and that's unfortunate, and and it's not widely discussed. But
which is why, again, the transparency that you are modeling is, I think, wonderful and should be emulated.
Yeah, but they get kind of the idea of like what's a formulated wine versus what's a
Right.
kind of crafted wine. All of these are important, but there is something that's happened, and I've been guilty of this too. I'll admit, but like this idea that natural wines are healthier for you. I try not
Right.
to go into that. It's more like, oh, I feel like, generally speaking, not 100% of the time, but like natural wines feel like they jive with my body a little bit better in terms of my like the digestibility and the digestibility of the alcohol. And for whatever reasons, that may be in natural wine. I don't know, lower alcohol or less extraction, but one of the things that's come up recently, or lower sulfur, certainly.
Right.
One of the things that has come up as kind of a counter argument to these native fermentations that don't have any sulfur added prior to fermentation kicking off is this production of what's called biogenic amines. And these are found in lots of fermented foods. So certain cheeses, like
Cured meats.
Right. Totally. All the delicious things in my mind. When I started reading about biogenic amines, it's like, well, I guess I don't have too much of a problem with them because I love these things and I eat them.
Right.
And but it had
they could be a big cause for people who think they're getting sulfite headaches, who are, so many people think they're allergic to sulfites, but the reality may very well be that they've had several wines with high levels of biogenic amines, and a lot of times those are in wines like red wines predominantly. Go on. I'll let you take
precisely.
Yeah.
I mean, I know probably about as much about this as you do, but it's something that I do think is interesting because, these recent studies have said, okay, well, as natural winemakings become more predominant and we're doing all these native fermentations that may have higher levels of certain bacteria metabolizing and creating these compounds, these biogenic amines, then the argument is with a small dose of sulfur, you could eliminate these bacteria and you could favor more Saccharomyces cerevisiae that does not produce these biogenic amines, and you'd have lower amount in your finished wine. So while that is true, the studies have shown that, but they didn't really take into account that much in the study that I read is the effect of pH on these things. So,
Right.
Yes, bacteria are more sensitive to sulfur dioxide. That's why that small amount of sulfur dioxide prior to primary fermentation can knock back the bacteria, but not the native yeast as much.
Right.
If you're working with a low pH, high acid grape, that naturally just inhibits bacterial production. So like, again, this idea, we worked with some Pinot this year and the pH was higher than what I was used to. And I did notice, I was like, oh man, there's this kind of like charcuterie thing going on in the fermenter, which I actually liked. But this is what led me to like looking up, I got it tested for, I got what's called the scorpion analysis done, which kind of gives you an idea of how much, what your count of lactic acid bacteria is versus acetic acid bacteria versus various a few like main categories of bacteria and yeast.
Brett, right? Is that part of scorpion and pediococcus and all
exactly. So we had higher lactic acid bacteria in this fermentation, and it was giving this kind of charcuterie thing. And I thought, well, maybe this wine's going to have higher biogenic amines. We haven't gotten that tested yet, but it's something that's interesting to me where I was like, okay, I think I have to watch grapes like Pinot and more of these kind of French cool climate grapes in California if I am going to try to make natural wine from them. These Italian grapes, they do great. They don't have any sort of lactic acid bacteria problems. Right. But on the other side, the lactic acid bacteria are like considered a probiotic. So it's kind of like, okay, well, the scorpion doesn't discern exactly what it lumps a bunch of species together, so it's hard to know.
Well, the lactic acid bacteria is what's responsible for just like any home fermentation. If you make sauerkraut, like that's that, right?
Your probiotics, if you get them through your foods or buy them in the store, that's lactic acid bacteria. So Yeah. So a lot to still kind of unpack, but it's an interesting thing. And I think, I don't know, maybe I'm making this up in my head, but I'm always like, oh, this kind of like philosophical war that goes on in the wine world among those who like use sulfur and those who don't. Like, I think
Right.
that those who use sulfur prior to fermentation are like, see, ha,
Right.
like, there is
Totally.
something. But I don't know. I think we just know so little about wine and
Yeah.
and fermentation, and it's just really all exciting to see new bits of information come out.
Okay. So I think we made it to the end of the in tank period,
Mm-hmm.
and I assume you press it and settle it, and then, or do you like off gross lees, or do you do anything different
Yeah.
than that?
Yeah,
What's
no,
next?
that's pretty accurate. We
Okay.
When I first started making wine and we didn't have as many vessels, I would
Uh,
just press it straight to barrel and it would be on
okay.
gross lees. But I do really like, or maybe no, we'd press it into like another open fermenter and then immediately put it to barrel because I always really like the free run, the drain juice from the tank, and the pressed
Yeah.
fraction, so the pressed wine to be married immediately. I do not like separating out pressed
Yeah.
wine from free run. We did that in 2020 because we were concerned about smoke taint on certain lots, and I
Uh,
just am like, oh, never want to do this again if I don't have to. So I just feel like the wine's so much more harmonious with those two components. So we
yeah.
do now that we have a little bit more equipment, we press it to a tank. We'll taste as we're pressing as well for
Okay.
tannin extraction, but I think tannin extraction happens more during fermentation. That's the time to look at that component. Pressing, I feel like if you're pressing at the correct moment, sure, the harder you press, the more tannic that small portion of juice will get, but it's a small portion, and in what's going to be a larger free run plus pressing sort of cuvee. So yeah, we press pretty hard. We press basically until we can't get any more juice out, is usually the way it goes. Occasionally we'll cut things early, but
Okay.
when the grapes are still a little wet. But and that all goes to tank, and then we usually rack it the next day into barrel if it's a dry wine. If it's still actively fermenting, usually we'll let it ferment in tank, finish out in tank, and then put it into barrel when it's dry or almost dry. So
Okay.
we try to put things in barrel when there's still a lot of dissolved carbon dioxide in the wine from
Sure.
fermentation.
This is like
Um,
one of the tools of natural winemaking, right?
totally.
It's the
Yeah.
timing, I guess, is a good way to put it, because you don't, if you let something sit a little too long and it expresses a little too much CO2, then you get a little more oxygen exposure than you want, which can lead to some of the things you don't want because you aren't working with sulfur a lot of the times or anything else.
Exactly. So say we do want to say a wine's still sweet and it's pressed and its components are in a tank together, but we do know that we want it off the gross lees and barrel. We'll actually rack it when it's still a little bit sweet um, into another tank to get it off those gross lees, and then put it to barrel when it's still a little effervescent. But I also
Yeah.
try not to put things too sweet to barrel because it just feels a little bit more risky. You can kind
Yeah.
of get things because again, you don't have that like kind of that mass. Fermentation's slowed down so much that it's nice
Mm.
to keep everything in one unit um,
Right.
until it's pretty dry. But like as
Well,
soon as it's dry, having still has that CO2 in it and putting it to barrel then is our
well,
goal.
and I mean, I know that tanks aren't sterile, but it seems like barrels have a lot more nooks and crannies to house little things that could get into
Totally.
your wine. Is that
Yeah.
is that a
Yeah.
concern at all?
Yeah. And for red wine in particular, for whatever reason, I don't know if it's the Brett thing or what, but yeah, going slightly sweet when things like yeast activity is starting to decline to barrel. Yeah. It just feels like a bad combination. It's like
Right.
there's not a critical mass of yeast to like kind of elbow out the other microbes you might not want in the room. And so I feel like if there's some sugar there, they're like, yeah, this, I don't know.
Right. Yeah.
There's room for us here to grow. So.
All right. So now we're in barrel, and I'm assuming, I don't know, I shouldn't assume. What happens now?
Yeah, once it's in barrel, early on, we top quite frequently, again, to keep as much of that dissolved CO2 in the wine as possible. So we might top and also the barrels, even though we steam them and rinse them before we go into them, and so they are pretty well hydrated, they kind of drink a little bit more wine in the beginning. So
Yeah.
you need to top them more frequently, but we'll top probably every week to 2 weeks. And, a lot of malolactic happens in barrel too. So again, just trying to keep them as topped as possible without overflowing them, because there is a little activity that the malolactic produces and it can overflow the barrels. So we kind of watch that phase, and then we'll move into like every 3 weeks topping, and then every month topping, just as the wine ages and as the barrels drink less, and depending on the humidity in the cellar. During the winter, it's pretty dry in our cellar, so we have to top a lot more. Yeah, but then comes spring, things get a little more humid, and then we don't have to top quite as much. And then Tim and I will usually taste each lot barrel by barrel throughout the aging process.
Is that so? We're in January. Do you start tasting around now? I mean, I'm sure you're tasting throughout, but are you starting to taste now in a different way?
Totally. Once malolactic's complete and you've given the wines a little bit of time to rest,
right,
now is about the time where you feel like, okay, I can start seeing what the character will be. I feel like, after harvest from like in November, December, even early January, depending on the year, the wine's still like in a teenage phase. And you're like, this is awkward. Like, take it with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
We're just going to let it figure itself out.
I've ruined it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Not freak out ourselves. We need the rest. We're exhausted from harvest. It's in everyone's best interest to just let them sleep for a minute. And then we'll start tasting, for our earlier release wines, we'll start tasting for blending for our other wines, just to kind of monitor them and see how they're developing. And we'll take notes, and maybe if a barrel, this is the tricky part with the technical sheets. For us, generally, we do add a little bit of sulfur to the lot prior to bottling. But on occasion, if we're tasting through a lot and one barrel in particular just seems a little odd, we may sulfur that one. If it's like, oh, this barrel's strangely getting oxidized and the rest of the lot isn't, which can happen. Or it's getting microbial and the rest of the lot isn't, even though, we had the same cleaning protocol for our barrels. We smelled every barrel before filling it to check that, they all smell clean, no vinegar or anything. For whatever reason, certain barrels take their own path. And so while this isn't frequent, occasionally we will need to like spot sulfur one barrel. And that for us is a great way to keep the overall sulfurs low in the lot and keep the like fruit and the vivacity of the wine intact without getting, certain spoilage characteristics either, which I think can distract from sense of place at the end of the day.
Right. All right. So if we're in the year, we're in barrel. I'm assuming you're sending samples out for testing, like you mentioned the scorpion test, but you're monitoring. I think that's a big tool in natural winemaking, right? Is actual testing and monitoring.
Yeah. So this is something new that we finally, again, there's been like a lot of kind of financial, backstops to a lot of our practices, but we're at a point now where we can financially afford to send out every single wine for volatile acidity analysis every month. So before we were just using our taste buds, which are great. I mean, having your palate is your number one tool. But sending things out for VA and seeing if your volatile acidity, how fast it is rising, which it will without sulfur over time. But the rate at which it's doing that is important to note. And then it's also kind of just fun to match that to what your palate's perceiving. Where you're like, oh, wow, this wine really carries the VA well, or this wine doesn't, or I thought the VA was lower or higher, is always kind of an interesting thing because there's so many other flavor components that are happening. So, but yeah,
Right.
really good I would say that's the main thing we monitor throughout, besides just tasting. So.
Right. Do you send out for mallet completion, or do you in-house test for that?
Oh, yes, we do. That is, yeah, that's it. That's the other one. So kind of
monitoring that.
Yeah, monitoring that after harvest. So, depending on when the lot came in October and November, we're doing a lot of malolactic. And we do want, to see things that go malolactic dry. And we let everything go through native malolactic fermentation, our reds, whites, and rosés. So we don't stop our whites or rosés from going through malolactic.
Right. And would that be a reason to filter potentially if one just never went through?
It could be. I have had one wine that was, I guess, probably low enough pH that the malolactic couldn't complete the.
Yeah, that's what I was going to bring up. That since, especially when you're working with low pH, like you want to be on the more stable side, you also have that a little more slow malolactic conversion and sometimes stalling because of it.
That one I didn't filter. I felt comfortable enough that if the wine it was a low enough malic number that it wouldn't, had it completed in bottle, it wouldn't push the cork out or anything from the carbon dioxide, and the wine would have tasted fine with a teeny little
frizzante.
Yeah, exactly. A small amount. I'm like, okay, looking at you, Basque country, for this one. So if you guys can do it, this can be fine for this wine. But I've been, kind of surprised with our lower pHs that we haven't had issues. Must have a really strong mallow house bug.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, everybody needs one.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so a lot of monitoring. I'm trying to draw out some of the things that maybe we take for granted, and as winemakers. But if you're getting into this and really don't want to screw up, these are some of the because you aren't intervening in a way. You aren't intervening. You're just monitoring and observing closely and making decisions. I mean, you are intervening, but you're allowing the wine's natural processes to preserve itself rather than bringing in outside preservatives as much as possible. Yeah,
exactly. I think that, one of the biggest trip ups that home winemakers can make, and I've done it too when I was making wines in my backyard in Davis and had school and other things to think about, where if I didn't have a really strict topping schedule and a monitoring schedule throughout aging, it would just slip another week and then maybe slip another week. And it's just really, it's one of those things that's not, monitoring them and tasting them is really fun, but topping is kind of not that exciting. So
yes,
I don't know. It's one of those things. It's like cutting your toenails. It just is important. But
yep.
Yeah, because until your wine's vinegar, irreversibly, then you don't feel. Preventative measures are always some of the hardest things. I mean, for us, for our health, it's just human nature to not deal with things until there's a problem in front of us. So, yeah.
Best to do that at home rather than on a large 4-ton lot or whatever, a 20-acre vineyard.
Exactly. Learning your lessons on the small scale is always great. You get the same humbling experience, but it doesn't mean that you're gutting your own financial future.
Exactly. Okay. Well, so when you go to bottle, how long? So we were talking about the Carignan. So what are we? How long are you in barrel?
Yeah, the Carignan. Usually about 18 months. We did do two versions where we, in 2019, we did a kind of a regular 18 months and then a long élevage, which was an additional year on top of that. So 2.5 years. It was a little bit of a warmer, riper, 2019 was just so abundant. We had really great, for California, really great winter rains heading into that vintage. And then we had abundant sunlight and a heavy crop, and everything just felt very abundant. So it wasn't overly ripe, but it felt like we could keep it in barrel a little bit longer, and it would really age beautifully. So that year we did kind of 2 different versions, and I like them both, just different wines. So we usually I like things to feel complete before putting them in bottle. I don't know how to describe this. This is like really kind of one of those things that I feel like you have to taste with people to help describe it to them. But even though we're using neutral oak, like, do the tannins feel like they would relax now at the same rate when you put them in like a pretty reductive environment? So in a bottle, a reductive environment. So like, do all the components of the wine feel like they would age in sync with one another? I don't know how else to describe it. That's when we bottle.
Interesting. Okay.
So
it's not just a set schedule or anything. You're kind of just, again, paying attention and making a decision based on intuition.
Yeah. And with wines, we do make year over year, like that same plot of Venturi Carignan every year. There tend to be patterns, even though there's vintage variation. So, it's not like one year we only age it for a year in barrel and another year it's 5 years, but, anywhere from the 18 to 18 to 20 months sort of range is about what we're looking at.
Yes. So you're talking the 2019. So this is the Richetti?
This is the Venturi. So we did make 2 single vineyard Carignans in 2019.
Okay. Long Élevage, it's called.
Yeah.
I love that. Okay. I'm just looking on your website now. So yeah, great. So, and it looks like, so you did add a little sulfur, I'm guessing, around bottling, or how if you would add some there, when would it be added?
Usually with sulfur before bottling, it's in like after all the barrels are racked up to tank. We might, if we've tasted the lot, we'll taste the lot all together on like kind of like a bench blend trial where we put small amounts proportionately of what the blend would taste like. And sometimes we send that out for analysis, but mostly it's based on taste. And in that last transfer, even though we try to keep we rack the wines as little as possible once they're in barrel. And we try to be very gentle in the process of racking them from barrel to tank. Just kind of tasting and thinking, okay, does this wine, would it tend more towards oxidation? And if it does, we're going to add a little bit of sulfur. And the amount will depend on how oxidized we think it could get. So because no matter what, we're going to pick up a little bit of oxygen, even though we gas rack them, it's just more or less to protect the wine from barrel to tank and then from tank into the bottle, because it does get jostled around quite a bit.
Got it. Great. I mean, any other final notes on that wine or that process?
That does it. The one thing that I think is interesting about that I found to be unique about this wine and this process is the extended maceration process. When we press this wine, it's kind of crazy. It tastes like mud water, like dirt water. It does not taste very good when we're pressing it. And it's more like a faith in the process of it. And then as it ages and as it's in bottle, the fruit character comes out more and more and more, which is totally reverse from most wines. Usually you bottle them and they're the fruitiest they're going to be, and then the fruit characters drop out faster than the other characters develop. And so I don't know what it is about the process, but it kind of acts reverse, or opposite to most wines and how they age.
I love that. Yeah. That's fascinating.
Always surprising.
And scary. I would imagine I would be terrified of.
I know the first year we did it in 2014, I was just like, oh man, this is a technique that I had learned. The whole cluster, kind of a little bit more extended maceration, was a technique I'd learned at Léon Barral in the south of France. This is the way that he made his Carignan, and I just loved the texture and the fruit and everything of the wine. But different wine. His did not taste like dirt when we pressed it. And so that first year I was like, oh gosh, okay, well, we won't repeat this again. And, but then tasting the wine in bottle and as it developed, I was like, oh yes, we definitely will do this again. It's great. So
That's
I don't
great.
know. Yeah. I tend to, maybe Tim doesn't love this, but I tend to like never get rid of wine. I mean, even if a barrel does, unless it's total vinegar, there's no coming back from that. But if something, if a barrel goes a little bit mousy from time to time, we don't have too much of that, thank goodness. With our pHs, again, I think helps. But, or we had a wine that went ropey, which is something I learned about in Davis.
Yeah.
And I was just like, oh, that's weird. I don't think I'll ever experience that. But one of our Chardonnay barrels in a lot went ropey. None of the other barrels did. And it was the strangest wine I've ever tasted in my life. I mean,
and what can you do anything with that?
It ended up going away. I don't know, something else in the aging process. We didn't have sulfur in the wine. There was something else. I guess some other new microbe came on the scene and metabolized some of that texture. It was so bizarre. I don't know.
And I've heard that about mouse as well. I mean, that sounds like it's documented at this point. If you haven't added sulfur, mouse will ultimately age away.
Yeah.
Have you experienced that?
I mean, I don't feel like I have a great sample size, but yes, I have experienced this with one barrel where it just resolved itself. But I'm always fascinated with this too, because Tim and I will taste together, and for whatever reason, our body chemistries, I can taste mouse more than he can. Probably, I guess I have a higher pH saliva than he does. But so it's like, there's that factor too that I'm always kind of curious about. Where I'm like, oh, is it that the mouse is gone, or I just can't taste it today because my body chemistry is different today than it was 2 months ago.
Yeah, no, yes. I have that too, where I'm very sensitive to most things, like, whether it's hydrogen sulfide or TCA or mouse or any Brett. I'm like, guys, this wine is ruined. They'll be like, what are you talking about? It's delicious. I'm like, oh, yeah. Okay, well, you guys enjoy that then.
Yeah, good, nice for you. So great as a winemaker, not as fun as a drinker to have that sensitive of a palate. Yeah.
Well, Martha, thank you so much. I really kept you for quite a while, and I really appreciate you sharing all this. Do you want to share any closing thoughts about making natural wine? I mean, anything you want.
I mean, I think it's for anybody out there listening who does want to experiment with making their own wines naturally. It is so much fun, and it's a little bit more fun too if you have a few friends to help you out. In my opinion, I think it's a very wonderful kind of community activity. But also don't be afraid to not kind of play it safe. There's a lot of text and information's out there, and if you go to your local kind of hobby winemaking store, they'll be telling you all the things you need to buy and to add to your wine. And the grape has everything you need to make wine. Yep. So just trust it and have fun. And, it's a small batch. You can always let it go, water your plants in the yard if it doesn't turn out, which I have had to do before. So,
well, thank you again. I really appreciate you talking and explaining all this. And I'm sure there's so much more that you can get into, but we don't have time.
It was totally my pleasure. Thanks for having me.